co-chairman Grassley and Senator Cornyn and Senator Hassan for being here as well. I'll make some opening remarks and then turn to Senator Grassley, and then we'll introduce and get the testimony of our witnesses. In my view, the central conflict of the 21st century has been and will be between the rule of law and the absence of rule of law. Democracy and transparent free markets on one side, and kleptocracy and opaque corruption on the other. The illicit narcotics trade is a central element in this clash. It devastates public health and safety, fuels corruption, and erodes democracy. It also relies on rule of law protections in the US and other democracies to safeguard the ill-gotten gains of its leaders in our property and financial institutions. Drug traffickers' business empires taken together are conservatively estimated at $150 billion annually, exceeding the GDP of 150 countries. Such a massive trade cannot exist without the coerced or willing complicity of government officials and law enforcement. The links between the narcotics trade and corruption abound. Last month, the former Mexican Minister of Public Security was convicted of bribery and narcotics charges in U.S. federal court. He is among a number of high-ranking officials and vetted law enforcement officials who currently await trial or have already been convicted in U.S. courts on various bribery and narcotics charges. In Afghanistan, Taliban members and other former government officials who vocally disavowed the narcotics trade simultaneously taxed it to enrich themselves and their cause. The U.S. has indicted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and many of his allies on charges of narco-terrorism and conspiracy to smuggle cocaine, demonstrating the drug trade's infiltration of the highest echelons of government. The former Rear Admiral of Guinea-Bissau was sentenced by a U.S. court for a conspiracy to facilitate the trade of cocaine in exchange for bribes, and the list could go on. It's no surprise that drug traffickers exploit countries with weak rule of law. According to Transparency International, the majority of countries designated as major drug-producing or transit countries are among the most corrupt in the world. Impunity rates in these countries are astonishingly high, meaning most perpetrators of crimes go unpunished. So how do we counter this narcotics-fueled corruption? First, we intentionally weave anti-corruption and anti-money laundering strategies into our broader national drug control strategy. We cannot ignore the connections between these problems. In a recent memorandum on the fight against corruption, President Biden called for an interagency review to help craft a whole-of-government strategy for combating corruption and holding transnational criminal organizations accountable. Co-Chair Grassley and I have asked the administration to include the Office of National Drug Control Policy in this review. Second, we can redouble cooperation with international partners to strengthen the rule of law, expand judicial transparency, and increase access to justice abroad. We must help partners increase their capacity to implement accusatory justice systems, safeguard judicial personnel and law enforcement from bribes and violence, and ensure that all members of society have access to swift and fair justice. Third, we should better leverage our sanctions. The US dollar is the most widely used currency in the world. US sanctions effectively freeze the property and assets of narcotics traffickers and those who assist them. But these measures could be much more powerful if we applied them in concert with partners around the globe. And finally, we have work to do at home. The Pandora Papers show how bad actors exploit lawyers, realtors, and other gatekeeping professionals who are not subject to Bank Secrecy Act reporting requirements to set up shell corporations for hiding ill-gotten gains. We can stop this by fully and swiftly implementing the Bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act to allow law enforcement to track the true owner of a shell company, by making geographic targeting orders permanent and nationwide to prevent narcotics traffickers and others from using the real estate market to hide illicit wealth, and by strengthening anti-money laundering regulations to reduce risk and strengthen law enforcement's hand. The illicit drug trade and the consequences that accompany it directly impact citizens worldwide. In the United States, from April 2020 to April 2021, over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. Globally, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime reports that, and I'm quoting here, since the start of the 21st century, organized crime has resulted in roughly the same number of killings as all armed conflicts across the world combined. That is a bloody record. For America to stop these harms and to remain an example to the world, we must prevail against the transnational drug trade and the corruption that it fosters. Today's hearing will examine how U.S. agencies address that nexus between the illicit drug trade and corruption, how we might improve our efforts against those forces, and how we can harness our partnerships with fellow rule of law countries to hold corrupt actors to account. Chairman Grassley, all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing, so connected with lots of deaths in the United States as a result of drugs, et cetera. Corruption threatens economic, social, and political development. The illicit drug trade is a massive barrier to ending corruption. So we're here today to discuss a complex nexus. Many countries struggle with regulating and stopping the flow of illegal and illicit drugs. This impacts Americans, as evidenced by the ongoing drug overdose crisis, which of course is driven by fentanyl. China ships fentanyl precursors to drug cartels in Mexico, who then funnel it into and through our southwest border. Now, for nearly 15 years, the United States has sought to work with allies in Mexico to stop the flow of drugs into our country through Merida initiative, yet Mexican-based drug trafficking organizations maintain control of the drug trade through violence, through intimidation, and through corruption. Some progress has been made in this space. Just a few weeks ago, Mexico recorded the largest seizure of fentanyl in the country's history. Also, our nations are having ongoing talks about how to stop the supply and demand of drugs. Rooting out corruption isn't confined to Mexico. So as we review our efforts, we must ensure strong oversight. In August of this year, the Justice Department Inspector General reported that DEA hasn't been keeping track of the partnerships with foreign law enforcement to combat the flow of illicit drugs. When the OIG checked, the Drug Enforcement Administration headquarters didn't even have a complete record of the foreign law enforcement units DEA personnel established. And according to the Office of Inspector General, after serious incidents involving alleged intelligence leaks and corruption, the Drug Enforcement Administration had failed to perform programmatic reviews on the causes of those incidents and to prevent similar events again. Another country on the front lines in our effort to stop the illegal flow of drugs is Haiti. In that country, we also have a need for strong oversight. Since the Haitian president was assassinated in July, we've learned that 2 Haitian nationals wanted in connection with that assassination have had past associations with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Haiti's DEA office was also the subject of recent whistleblower allegations and damaging reports issued in July by the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. Yesterday, Senator Durbin and I sent a letter to the Drug Enforcement Administration raising our concerns related to both the Office of Inspector General and the Office of Special Counsel reports. I look forward to getting prompt answer to those questions. Today's hearing is on a broad and complex issue, so I want to learn about the best ways to address the connections between illicit drug trade and corruption, what tools can be used, and what programs the federal government has in place. But it's also our job to ask if these tools and programs are effective, if they're used in a good way of taxpayers' money, and how to improve those tools. I look forward to having interesting and important discussion with our witnesses on these subjects. So thanks again, and I thank our witnesses for taking time to be here to help us explore this issue.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley. I will now introduce the witnesses, and then each will have 5 minutes to make their statements, and then the questioning may proceed. I think I'll just go right across the line and start with Ambassador Todd Robinson, who is our Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Ambassador Robinson last served as the Director of the International Student Management Office at the National Defense University. Prior to this, he served in a number of capacities at the State Department, including as Senior Advisor for Central America in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, as the Charge in Caracas, Venezuela, and as our U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Guatemala, where, by the way, he was the multiple times successor of my grandfather, who was also our minister in Guatemala many, many years ago. Ambassador Robinson is a career diplomat with the exalted rank of career minister. Next, we have Bruce Schwartz, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General at DOJ, where he supervises the Department's Office of International Affairs, as well as the Department's Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development, Assistance, and Training, and the International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program. In this role, he coordinates the overseas operational activities of the Department, including all extraditions and mutual legal assistance in transborder criminal and terrorism cases. He also manages the Department's overseas capacity-building programs, which work with partner nations on issues ranging from counterterrorism to transnational organized crime to anti-corruption. As the Department's Counselor for International Affairs, Mr. Schwartz advises the Attorney General on international issues, chairs the Department's International Affairs Committee, and represents DOJ in international negotiations and multilateral and bilateral consultations. Finally, Shannon Greene is Senior Advisor to the Administrator and Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Task Force at one of my favorite government agencies, USAID. Previously, Ms. Greene was the Senior Director of Programs at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC, where she oversaw the organization's global efforts to recognize the dignity and rights of civilians, prevent civilian harm, and protect civilians caught in conflict. Before that, Ms. Greene was the Director and Senior Fellow of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She also served as the Senior Director for Global Engagement on the National Security Council, and for nearly a decade led strategic planning, program design, and policy engagement at USAID. So we are fortunate to have such a strong panel. I'm grateful to you all. Ambassador Robinson, please proceed.
Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, distinguished members of the caucus, thank you for calling this hearing and for the strong bipartisan support and attention to the fight against corruption. I am pleased to be here today with colleagues from the Department of Justice and the U.S. Agency for International Development, with whom we are working side by side to tackle this complex set of challenges. The illicit drug trade is probably the single greatest revenue stream behind corruption globally, and it gives transnational criminal organizations a devastatingly powerful capacity to corrupt government institutions. Corruption is the illicit drug trade's great force multiplier, capable of elevating drug trafficking from a localized criminal and public health challenge into a threat to democracy, national security, and the rule of law. Combating it is core to INL's mission and woven into our work in over 90 countries. We are supporting primarily 3 lines of effort targeting prevention, enforcement, and accountability. The first is building shared standards and political will against corruption at the global level. Over the past 2 decades, INL has led U.S. efforts to develop shared global standards against corruption and the architecture for anti-corruption cooperation across borders. INL leadership was key to negotiating the world's only global legally binding commitment against corruption, the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, completed in 2003. Based on U.S. domestic best practices, this treaty now requires 188 governments to implement the same anti-corruption standards to which we hold ourselves. To cite one example, over the past 2 years, INL led efforts against foreign bribery through the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, working closely with like-minded partners to secure the first-ever time-bound commitment from all G20 countries to criminalize foreign bribery and enforce foreign bribery legislation. Progress in building these global standards helps shrink the enabling environment that allows drug trafficking and all other forms of transnational crime to thrive. The second pillar of our work is focused on strengthening capacity in partners to prevent, detect, and hold accountable those that participate in corruption. INL's foreign assistance programs support the capacity of governments and civil societies to build transparent, accountable institutions, strengthen criminal justice authorities' ability to detect, investigate, and prosecute corruption, including corruption relating to drug trafficking, and assist officials to work across borders to build cases and track proceeds. An example of this, in Albania, our work to strengthen the capacity of Albanian authorities to investigate and deter high-level corruption and organized crime contributed to the arrest last month of a dozen corrupt police officers involved in drug trafficking. INL's anti-corruption efforts hit every facet of our program in Mexico, where it has helped strengthen the capacity of security and justice institutions to reduce opportunities for corruption, prosecute offenders, and promote a culture of accountability. To complement and reinforce our diplomacy and foreign assistance, our third line of effort employs targeted sanctions and deterrence tools to discourage high-level corruption and support the work of law enforcement. INL manages 2 rewards programs targeting high-level drug traffickers and other transnational criminal leaders, which have helped our law enforcement partners bring over 75 international drug kingpins and crime bosses to justice. We also manage 2 anti-corruption visa restriction authorities, and in close cooperation with the Department of Treasury, support implementation of the corruption prong of the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program. The public designation of corrupt actors under our visa restriction authorities has significantly reinforced our broader anti-corruption agenda, including through increasing media attention and spurring governments to remove designees from office or to open law enforcement investigations and to build momentum to adopt anti-corruption reforms. Mr. Chairman, my testimony today has focused on the work of my Bureau, but let me end with an important point that cannot be stressed often enough. Political will on the part of our partners to confront corruption and the drug trade is absolutely critical. Even the best resourced and planned U.S. foreign policy intervention cannot succeed if our partners are not equally or more committed to the challenge. Governments must own their efforts to enact reforms and disrupt drug networks and the corruption they engender, and we must brace ourselves for pushback. Corruption can run deep throughout institutions and societies, and those that benefit from it do not stand aside quietly. Confronting corruption often means things may get worse before they get better. We are prepared for that reality and are firmly committed to staying the course and combating this threat aggressively. The stakes are too high. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Much appreciated. Mr. Schwartz, to you. You may need to punch your mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse and Co-Chairman Grassley, distinguished members of the caucus. There are 3 points I would like to emphasize this morning. First, the Department of Justice is deeply committed to investigating and prosecuting narcotics traffickers and their illicit financial networks. Second, we are equally committed to building the capacity of our foreign counterparts to do the same. And third, both missions are critical to the security of the American public. Let me turn first to our own investigations and prosecutions. As I noted, they're aimed not only at traffickers, but at their financial networks. And let me cite just two examples from the past month. As I think you may have seen, in October, we announced Operation Dark Hunter. This was an operation led by J-Code, the Department of Justice's Joint Criminal Opioids and Darknet Enforcement Team, that was a global enforcement action resulting in 150 arrests worldwide and the seizure of more than $31 million in cash and virtual currency. Similarly, last month, we announced a new tip line for Central America to provide leads to the Department of Justice's Northern Triangle Anti-Corruption Task Force, a joint task force bringing together our narcotic and dangerous drugs section, our money laundering and asset forfeiture section, and our fraud section. In all of these respects, I would like to pay particular tribute to Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, the members of this caucus for your focus on the dark economy, and in particular, the provisions on corporate transparency that appeared in the NDAA this last year. Those are significant steps forward, and we're grateful for your leadership. Those are some of the examples of what we're doing in this country. But as I said, we're equally committed to ensuring that our foreign counterparts have the capacity to do the same in their country. From the Department of Justice's perspective, this is not simply a matter of foreign assistance. This is about protecting the American public. We need to have partners who can deal with narcotics trafficking, with corruption, with transnational crime before it reaches our border. And in my written statement, I've set out a number of examples of how we've achieved that, particularly through the work of the two offices at the Department of Justice solely dedicated to this task. Our Overseas Prosecutorial Development Office, known as OPDAT, and our International Criminal Investigative Program, known as ICITAP. Let me cite just two of those examples. In late October, Colombian security forces arrested Otoniel, the leader of the Clan del Golfo, which is Colombia's largest narcotics trafficking network. The two Colombian prosecutors who brought the charges against Otoniel were part of OPDAT's, the Department of Justice's program focusing on Clan del Golfo, our technical working group that we had with Colombia. Similarly, in the same year, just a few months earlier, across the globe, as Ambassador Robinson has pointed out, in Albania, the Albanian Special Anti-Corruption and Anti-Trafficking Unit, known as SPAC, which is mentored by OPDAT and ICITAP, made numerous arrests, including, as has been noted, high-ranking police officials, an Albanian prosecutor, and other government officials, and also seized narcotics worth $61 million. Those are just a few of the achievements of OPDAT and ICITAP, and we obtain these achievements because the capacity building model we have has four unique aspects. First, we deploy highly experienced federal prosecutors and senior law enforcement experts. Second, we deploy them for long-term positions in host countries for multiple-year assignments. Third, we're not engaged simply in training. That's not our objective. Our goal is to engage in case-based mentoring, that is to help our counterparts conduct investigations and prosecutions in their most complex cases. And finally, because OPDAT and ICITAP deploy federal employees, not contractors, they can reach back to all of the Department of Justice's assets, can coordinate with our operational teams on the ground, and can ensure that we're working collectively. Now, OPDAT and ICITAP are not funded to do any of this work. We have to look to our colleagues at INL, my friend, the ambassador here, or state counterterrorism. But notwithstanding this, the accomplishments have been, as I've said, strong, consistent over the 30 years that these organizations have been in existence. And I'm happy to say that I think we've also made a significant step by INL's willingness to agree to our proposal for the creation of a global Anti-Corruption Rapid Response Fund, which will allow the department to deploy prosecutors and agents more agilely, more quickly to deal with urgent problems of corruption and narcotics trafficking abroad. And whatever we can do to improve our agility in this regard also improves our ability to protect the American public. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Schwartz. Ms. Greene.
Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, and distinguished members of the caucus. Thank you for bringing us together today to discuss the dual threats of corruption and the illicit narcotics trade. I am pleased to have the opportunity to share how USAID's long-term investments in development and deep network of local staff and partners help to address these challenges as a complement to the efforts of my interagency colleagues. As Administrator Power said on USAID's 60th anniversary, corruption is basically development in reverse. It undermines the rule of law, scares away private investment, contributes to insecurity, and weakens support for democracy itself. Drug trafficking thrives in places where corruption has crippled economic investment, crushed faith in the government, and caused enforcement officials to turn a blind eye to their obligations. USAID is taking a number of steps to tackle the problem of corruption and its effects on drug trafficking, mobilizing its missions in more than 80 countries. First, USAID provides vital support to civil society organizations and media outlets that expose corruption and generate pressure for reform, often at great personal and professional risk to themselves. For example, since 2007, USAID has funded the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. This network releases more than 80 major investigations per year that uncover corruption, drug trafficking, and other forms of crime. For instance, they have documented the evolution of Balkan criminal groups into a syndicate that has earned billions and influenced politicians, police, and prosecutors across the region, illustrating how the proceeds of drug trafficking can be used to pay off public officials, who then in turn undermine counter-narcotics efforts. It is not enough, though, to expose corruption and crime. We need governments to take action against it. And that is why USAID pairs this support to non-governmental organizations with robust investments in democratic institutions and the rule of law. For example, in Mexico, USAID is strengthening oversight and regulatory bodies at the federal and state levels in order to reduce corruption at key points where government and citizens interact, such as when obtaining licenses or permits. In Mali, USAID is building the capacity of justice sector institutions and civil society to fight corruption, including along key trade routes, where citizens just seeking to earn a living are regularly subject to rent-seeking behavior and harassment. USAID has long worked on improving government transparency and accountability. These efforts make it harder for criminals to profit from corruption and drug trafficking and to use those profits to pay off public officials. In Moldova, USAID has worked with the Central Electoral Commission and political parties to improve financial disclosures and integrity. This work is essential to detecting attempts by external actors to co-opt politicians to serve their interests rather than the interests of the population. As the largest bilateral development agency, USAID has the unique ability to root out corruption and drug trafficking through our work in multiple sectors. For example, cartels in Latin America use illicit gold mining to generate billions in revenue and to launder the proceeds of their crime. USAID's gold mining program in Colombia has removed more than $160 million from the illegal economy, paying for itself more than 8 times over. USAID recognizes the deep linkages between corruption and transnational organized crime. As such, we are adapting our programming to transform the fight against corruption, including by tackling it from a variety of angles. This includes increasing our agility to respond to what can be fleeting windows of opportunity, as well as moments of backsliding, enhancing collaboration with other U.S. departments and agencies, local anti-corruption reformers, and the private sector, and experimenting with new programmatic approaches, tools, and technologies to tackle transnational corruption and crime. USAID's assistance is essential to addressing the underlying conditions that foster the illicit narcotics trade to devastating effect in the United States and around the globe. We look forward to deepening those efforts in coordination with members of Congress, our partners across the U.S. government, the private sector, and very importantly, the frontline reformers and activists in the countries in which we work. I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. You know, it strikes me that the United States is involved in a global contest, which you might even call a clash of civilizations, between rule of law world and non-rule of law world. I'll have to come up with a better term for non-rule of law world, but it's basically kleptocracy, autocracy, and criminality. And it strikes me that in my lifetime, most of the evil that has been done to America has emerged from non-rule of law world. Given that background, do each of you agree that there is a significant nexus between international corruption and American national security?
Yes, absolutely.
Without a doubt, Senator.
100%.
So if we're going to win that contest, prevail in that clash, one of the things it seems we have to address is the problem of illicit proceeds of all that corruption, in particular the problem of illicit proceeds of all that corruption finding shelter in rule of law. If you're the biggest thief in your country, what you've stolen is only as safe as the next big thief to come and take you over and steal what you stole. So what you need is to get your pelf, your crooked goods, sheltered behind rule of law. And so in very significant ways, it seems to me, we rule of law nations are aiding and abetting in legal terms or giving aid and comfort to in military terms, our own enemies. We made a big step against that, thanks to Chairman Grassley, who worked very hard on the beneficial ownership rules, which are being written by Treasury right now, I hope with a lot of input from all of your organizations. How important is it that America clean up its own act in this regard and also lead the rest of the rule of law nations to have common cause against that kind of shelter for ill-gotten gains? Ambassador Robinson, why don't you go first? We'll just call these right across the line.
Well, I obviously, I think it's absolutely important that we put our house in order, but INL is focused on making sure that our partners have the tools that are necessary to uncover, to go after, and to know when these ill-gotten gains are entering their system.
Is this going to be a priority, do you think, for the Summit for Democracy that the president has called?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the idea that, in fact, I know one of the areas that the summit will focus on is corruption broadly, but anti-money laundering.
And specific to your line of work, is there more that we could or should be doing with sanctions? And do you need any further authorities from Congress to apply further sanctions to discourage both kleptocracy and aiding and abetting of it by those in rule of law countries?
I think we are in a good place sanction-wise, but one, because we have the ability to publicly, sometimes privately, but mostly publicly, name and shame those who are moving this money.
Well, let us know if you would like more authority because I think, really want to try to address this problem. Last question for Mr. Schwartz. DEA within the Department of Justice focuses a lot on interdiction. Our prosecutions focus a lot on interdiction. It seems to me that we focus a little bit less on follow the money, but for every pound of cocaine, for every package of heroin, there's a financial transaction on the other side of it, and making sure that we pursue the money can be, well, they said follow the money in Watergate for a reason. And then beyond that is the question of disrupting the safe havens where that money goes. And it seems that most of our attention is to interdiction, less, but some is to follow the money, and not so much has been to disrupting the safe havens to which the money flows. Are you doing anything to try to correct or adjust that?
Mr. Chairman, the Drug Enforcement Administration.
Microphone.
Mr. Chairman, the Drug Enforcement Administration plays a key role, as you say, in disrupting narcotics trafficking networks, but increasingly is also focused on the connected illicit financial networks that make those trafficking networks possible. And that's reflected, including in their involvement in J-Code, our criminal opioids darknet enforcement team, as well as steps they've taken on their own investigations to focus on the financial flows. We couldn't agree more. It is essential that we do this. And as you've said, the fact that we've put our own house in order, I can say as the department official responsible for our international cooperation, has been essential. To be able to say that we're doing what we've asked other countries to do is critical, as well, of course, as making it possible for us to conduct these kinds of investigations. And in that regard, we've continued our focus, including through the Kleptocracy Initiative, which is now celebrating its 10th anniversary, to track down funds that have transited the United States or have been invested in the United States, to seize and forfeit those funds, and then to return them to the countries from which they were stolen. I think it's really been one of the most effective things we've done, and we couldn't agree more. This is a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between two different types of governance, of how citizens are treated, and we're determined at the Department of Justice to show that we're working not only to protect the American people, but the people of the countries that are allies and our partners.
Thank you. Chairman Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with Ambassador Robinson. In August, the Justice Department Inspector General released a report that showed DEA is failing to oversee foreign law enforcement units. The State Department provides funding for some of these foreign law enforcement units and facilitates necessary agreements between the United States embassies and the host countries. Have you considered whether the Bureau should review its own processes as they relate to the DEA program in light of the IG's findings?
Mr. Co-Chairman, the fact is we are reviewing our relationship with our partners all the time. We took the GAO report very seriously, and we will continue to review to make sure that we are focusing on taking good care of the American people's resources.
What oversight, Ambassador, does the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs do to ensure that the funds it provides for DEA-supported foreign law enforcement units will be used for their intended purpose?
We sign agreements, interagency agreements with all of the different agencies that we work with. So that's at the Washington level, that's how we make sure that we are focusing on the funds that go to these agencies. But also at post level, the country team led by the ambassador and DCM are also making sure that they are focused on how funds are being spent by our interagency partners.
Also, Mr. Ambassador, the IG recommended that DEA conduct a comprehensive review of its local foreign law enforcement units to ensure that necessary and appropriate agreements are up to date. Is the DEA actively coordinating with the State Department to make those determinations?
The DEA actively coordinates on a regular basis with the State Department on issues such as this.
To your knowledge, are up-to-date letters of agreement in place for all the countries where DEA has established relationships with local foreign law enforcement units?
To my knowledge, yes.
Okay. For Mr. Schwartz, we had a recent Justice Department Inspector General report, the same one I've referred to, found that the DEA doesn't have a complete list of foreign law enforcement units that it supports and doesn't have a complete record of funding provided by the state and defense departments to support the units. Do you agree that the DEA headquarters should conduct strong oversight of the relationships its country officers form with foreign law enforcement partners?
Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. The department, of course, takes the Inspector General's report extremely seriously. And I'm happy to note that on August 26th, the DEA announced that it was doing an independent, top-to-bottom review of its foreign and international footprint, including all of the issues raised by the Inspector General. And we, of course, will follow that independent review and take any appropriate actions that are suggested thereby.
Also, Mr. Schwartz, do you agree that when serious incidents occur involving DEA-supported foreign law enforcement units, it's incumbent upon the DEA headquarters to conduct oversight to identify problems and prevent similar incidents?
I'm confident, Senator, that that is the position taken by the DEA administrator, by all of those involved at DEA headquarters, to carefully monitor this activity and, again, to abide by the results of the independent review of their international footprint.
Okay. And also, Mr. Schwartz, I recently chaired this drug caucus field hearing in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. At that hearing, there was a person named Jeffrey Stamm, director of the Midwest HIDA, testified that every state, including Iowa, is a border state. He stated we need to deal with the flood of drugs like fentanyl impacting our country. You mentioned in your written testimony 2 Department of Justice anti-corruption programs that work in Mexico. How are these programs and trainings effective in stopping fentanyl and other deadly drugs from entering the United States?
Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. The broader framework, of course, for our cooperation with Mexico has now been set by the new bicentennial framework and the high-level security dialogue, which Attorney General Garland attended, as did I, the ambassador, last month. That's its framework that's going to focus us on illicit finance, on precursor chemicals, and to provide a new direction forward.
Next is Senator Hassan, and she'll be followed by Senator Cornyn and then Senator Lujan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Co-Chair Grassley for convening us. I want to thank the witnesses not only for being here today, but for your work. And I just want to note that as we talked about the stunning statistic just being reported of 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States in a year of the pandemic, how critical your work is. I also know that while we are talking today about illicit international drug trafficking, it is really important that we also recognize that all of this illicit trafficking is influenced by demand here at home. And we certainly know that the pharma industry has influenced that demand, sometimes with reckless, other times with predatory behavior, and sometimes enabled by a fairly lax FDA oversight and potential conflicts of interest there. So I just don't want to take our eye off that ball either. To Ambassador Robinson, I just wanted to start following up on a line of questioning that Co-Chair Grassley was asking. We continue to see illicit fentanyl trade in the U.S. that originated in China As Senator Grassley mentioned, Chinese manufacturers produce fentanyl precursor chemicals and then sell and ship them to drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. The cartels then produce fentanyl from these precursor chemicals and smuggle it across the southern border. I just want to drill down a bit, Ambassador. Criminals profit at every stage of this process. How can we use existing money laundering rules to combat the financing of illicit fentanyl trade?
We are focused very closely on making sure that we are following the money. Current rules allow us to work more closely with the Department of Justice and DEA to make sure that any money that is trying to reach our shores is investigated. We are working with our partners to make sure, particularly Mexico, to make sure that any resources that they have the tools to investigate, working with their prosecutors to investigate the illicit gains that are coming from these from this drug trade. So that's how INL would focus on this effort.
Thank you. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Schwartz, I share the encouragement that you expressed about recent operations spearheaded by the Joint Criminal Opioid and Darknet Enforcement, or J-Code, such as Operations Dark Hunter and Disruptor, that have taken down illegal drug marketplaces on the dark web and led to hundreds of arrests worldwide. I'm working on legislation to permanently authorize J-Code and bolster the resources it receives. Can you speak to how J-Code, in conjunction with federal, state, local, and international law enforcement partners, is able to pursue and shut down dark web illegal drug marketplaces, both in the U.S. and around the world?
Well, thank you, Senator. J-Code, I think, represents the future of much of what we're going to see in terms of dealing with illicit finance, particularly as we move towards the dark net and cryptocurrencies. And by bringing together experts both on the drug side, the money laundering side, and our cyber experts, it is the future of how we're going to interact on this. We found that J-Code also works well and helps coordinate our various law enforcement agencies at the federal level and to help advance state actions as well. And we're also doing this through other means. Thanks to support from INL, we've created a worldwide network of cyber prosecutors through OPDAT. We're stationed abroad, working to build the capacity of our foreign counterparts to deal with cryptocurrency and other money laundering techniques. And we've also built out, with our prosecutors on the ground, working on particular cases with Mexico, a money laundering group that's already met twice in the short time it's been in existence in this fall. And we expect, again, this will not simply be training. This will be case-based, directed activity.
Well, thank you. I look forward to working to make sure that J-Code has the resources it needs to continue this vital work. I wanted to touch on one more thing with you, and we're running out of time, so I may do it for the record, but I am sure that Chairman Whitehouse will talk more about the amendment to the National Defense Bill that he and I have been working on, and I think it's going to get introduced to target drug cartels' money laundering. One key piece of the bill is providing resources, assistance, and training to other countries. Can you and Ambassador Robinson speak to how this support will help target drug trafficking organizations where they're most vulnerable?
Thank you. We feel at the Department of Justice that there is more we can do in this regard. We can place prosecutors, if we have the funding to do it, to serve as mentors, again, focused on cases, on building out cases involving illicit finance that affect our country. So we look forward to any opportunity to discuss how that can best be done. But from our perspective, and this goes to Senator Grassley's point, there's no better expenditure of monies for the American taxpayer and to protect the American taxpayer than placing our prosecutors and investigators on the ground to build the capacity of our counterparts to obtain results and to defeat these criminal organizations before they reach our borders.
Well, I thank you. And Ambassador, I'll follow up with you perhaps for the record since I'm a bit over time here. I appreciate all of you very much.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you all for being here today. Ambassador Robinson, I could not agree more with the final statement that you made, talking about the importance of political will and cooperation in the countries that we're trying to assist. And frankly, without that political will, there's not a whole heck of a lot the U.S. can do, in my opinion. We've not shown ourselves very good at nation building, and particularly when we're working against the powers that be in foreign countries, it makes things hard, if not downright impossible. I'm thinking about, for example, President Lopez Obrador's backtracking on law enforcement, just on extraditions. For example, in 2019, there were 17 extraditions from Mexico, 22 and 20, and so far in 2021, there have only been 9. We're waiting on visas from the government of Mexico so that our DEA, federal agents, can get in there and do their job. And unfortunately, President Lopez Obrador has said that using force against the drug cartels doesn't resolve anything, and essentially has raised the white flag. What I want to ask the panel about is transnational criminal organizations. We talk about transnational criminal organizations, sometimes use the word cartels and the like. But I've heard it said, and I think it's true, but I'd like to get your opinion, that these criminal organizations are by and large commodity agnostic. In other words, they're in it for the money, and they don't care if they have to smuggle drugs, people, traffic, and sex, whatever it is. Do you agree, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Schwartz, that these transnational criminal organizations are commodity agnostic?
Absolutely, Senator. And not only would I agree with that, but I think it's important to recognize that they use the same routes for all of those quote-unquote commodities. You know, we know that they're moving people through the same routes that they're moving drugs north and trying to move money and guns south. So absolutely agree that they are agnostic.
Mr. Schwartz and then Ms. Greene.
Senator, absolutely, and we have taken steps to address exactly that issue, which you've so accurately pointed out. And that includes building out task forces with Mexico and Central America focused on human smuggling groups that tie into organized crime. And beyond the other areas you've talked about, so there are less obvious areas in which they're commodity agnostic, including wildlife trafficking and natural resources trafficking, where we've seen very devastating losses and tremendous profits for the organized crime groups. And here, too, working with State Department, we've placed prosecutors overseas to focus on that issue so that we can attack organized crime from all fronts. And Senator, I'd also be glad to work with your staff on the extradition issues. The numbers we have from Mexico are significantly higher, including some key people that were extradited in the cartel context, but we'd be glad to discuss that for the record.
Thank you. Ms. Greene?
Yes, Senator, we too at USAID see those linkages, and that's why the Anti-Corruption Task Force is viewing our work on anti-corruption as intimately connected to the work that USAID does on countering wildlife trafficking, on countering the trafficking of natural resources, on transnational organized crime. We're building the capacity of our government partners and our non-governmental partners to detect the flow of those commodities, whether it be gold or timber, because we do see very intimately those linkages. And we know that we need new partnerships, new kinds of technologies, and new approaches in order to address the transnational flow of those kinds of commodities.
Well, I thank each of you for your answer. I think, obviously, coming from a border state that's seen a huge influx of migrants coming across the border, 1.7 million so far this year, with approximately 300,000 plus getaways, although I don't know how you count the people you never saw, but that's one of the estimates that have been given to us. But of course, what we've seen is that these transnational criminal organizations are pretty sophisticated, And one of the ways they succeed in getting drugs across the border, and the vast majority of the drugs that killed 100,000 people last year make their way, unfortunately, across the southwestern border. These cartels will flood the zone with people, with migrants, and then the Border Patrol has to get off the front lines to process unaccompanied children and the like. In the meanwhile, it's a 4-lane highway across the border opened up to the cartels to move drugs into the United States. I know many people view what's happening at the border as simply an immigration issue, but I think it's inextricably intertwined with the other illegal conduct that's occurring, particularly smuggling drugs. Do you agree, Ambassador Robinson, or do you have a different view?
No, as we said before, we absolutely believe that the routes that are being used for drugs are used for any number of commodities. The migration challenges at the border, I don't think happen coincidentally, and we are working with our partners in Mexico to address just those issues. And I would also add that you raised an issue on visas for DEA agents. That issue was raised by both the Secretary and the Attorney General during our trip to Mexico for the bicentennial agreement.
I hope they have a breakthrough in that.
If I might, Senator, we do understand that issue has been resolved.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Cornyn. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Schwartz, is it illegal, is it a crime for United States financial institutions, banks, to launder money for drug cartels or narco-terrorist organizations?
Senator, of course, money laundering is a crime. The circumstances of the particular case would have to be considered. I couldn't answer that in the abstract. Knowing laundering of funds for a narcotics cartel.
Mr. Schwartz, let me just help you here. It's really troubling that you cannot just say yes.
Well,
let me ask this question again. Is it a crime for banks in the United States to illegally launder money for a drug cartel?
Yes, Senator, it is a crime to engage in money laundering on behalf of a drug cartel.
And maybe there was an anticipation of what my follow-up is. Look, every time that I've had a briefing and looking at this issue, there's always a report when we look at other countries of bringing attention to the campesinos, the farmers, who are being pressured by the cartels to grow drugs. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to talk about the illicit financial markets. So I appreciate in your opening testimony that you touched on the importance of illicit financial markets, and that in response to a question from one of my colleagues, you also were clear that there was criminal pursuit of illicit financial crimes. The reason that I wanted to ask these particular questions and open up there, I'm sorry it took so long to get where I am now, is there was a decision made in 2012 with HSBC in the United States to levy a $1.9 billion fine, which is about 5 weeks of profits for the bank. But there was a decision by the United States Department of Justice not to criminally prosecute anyone that was caught laundering money in that case. 175 criminal charges that we know about. Is that going to change?
Well, Senator, I'd be glad to discuss with your staff and get more details of the background for the resolution in that particular case. But in terms of the more general question you ask, our commitment to go after these illicit networks, to go after anyone who knowingly is laundering funds, is ironclad.
Are they going to go to jail? Will we prosecute them, or are we just going to give them deferred prosecution agreements? What's the goal here?
Senator, where the facts exist, where the prosecution can be conducted, we do that, exactly those steps.
I'm sorry to be so passionate about this. Mr. Chairman, this is an area that I have a lot of concern because in case after case that I've tried to study in this particular area, the United States Department of Justice puts people in jail that they find selling small amounts of narcotics. They're in jail today, even though we're legalizing marijuana in state after state and hallucinogenics and mushrooms and others. They're still in jail. But no one went to jail from HSBC. So that was in 2012. Let me back up a little bit. 2003, HSBC promised and agreed to a consent order to clean itself up for money laundering. They promised and they agreed to this by the United States. Same thing happened in 2010. They followed up and they promised and agreed to another consent order. 2012, the United States levies a $1.9 billion fine, 5 weeks of profits. No one goes to jail, 175 criminal charges do not get prosecuted. 2018, HSBC agrees to pay another $100 million because they got caught laundering money again. 2019, $192.5 million fine. HSBC gets caught laundering money. 2017, the United States Department of Justice, I'll back up a couple years, lifted its deferred prosecution agreement. Mr. Chairman, drugs are going to be continued to be sold as long as people can profit and they get a slap on the wrist. And the people that are laundering the money, knowingly laundering this money, they're just as guilty as every other element of these cartel organizations where there's record murders in Mexico, threats of people that are trying to do everything they can to escape this. Nothing's going to change unless people go to jail that are knowingly laundering money. That's number one. Number two, Ms. Greene, with the work you and the ambassador are doing, are we also in the United States doing something about the flow of guns into Mexico, illegal flow of guns? Ms. Greene?
I'll have to defer to my colleagues. That's not something that USAID works on.
Ambassador?
The short answer is yes. This is an issue that came up during our summit in Mexico, and we've committed to working much more closely with our interagency partners. We've committed to working much more closely on this issue.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll go back, and I appreciate, I'll get something on the record, Mr. Schwartz, because I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, one thing that I'm also hopeful that we can do here is have the Department of Justice submit to the appropriate committee, whether it's this or another, the suspicious activity reports associated with the cases that I just talked about, so that we can try to get our hands and understand what's going on here. I think that it's also clear that these monitors that are being hired by the banks with the permission of the Department of Justice and these deferred prosecution agreements, I don't know why the banks get to pay them and hire them and get to determine who's going over there to do the work. It seems that we should have investigators from the federal government doing this work. I don't know why they get a pass. So this is an area that I'm going to keep pressing and pushing now that I'm a member of the United States Senate. Because again, this is not going to stop as long as people just pay a small fine and a small penalty, and then they get to go home with their deferred bonuses while people are dying on the streets of America and in other parts of the world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Let me thank the panel with respect to Senator Lujan's point about corporate enforcement. Mr. Schwartz, if you could pass back to Deputy Attorney General Monaco my compliments on the new corporate prosecution memorandum that she announced, which I think is a very important step in the right direction for the department. I think that we have work to do to prepare for the Summit for Democracy in this area and make sure that that is a success at rallying nations around the world to this standard. Because frankly, if 80% of our allies in rule of law land help and 20% don't, guess where the dirty money will go? To those 20%. So we really have to do what the administration did with the international minimum tax and create a very significant international consensus around this, and continue to press for the strongest beneficial ownership regulations that you need. I know that Treasury has the pen on that, but I expect that they're listening to USAID, I expect that they're listening to DOJ, FBI, and DEA, and I expect that they're listening to the State Department, and if they're not, let me know so I can make sure that they do. And finally, if there's anything else that you need from Congress by way of improved support resources, or legal authorities, don't hesitate to come to us. I think, as you've seen, this is a matter of significant bipartisan interest in the Senate. I'm grateful to all of you for your service and for your testimony today. And I'll excuse this panel so that we can bring on the next panel, and we'll go into recess just for a few moments while the electronics are done to bring our next panel on via the internet.
Thank you.
All right, let me call the hearing back to order for our second panel. I appreciate very much all of the witnesses' participation, particularly since they're coming from far away. One is located in Vienna, another is in Iraq, and another is in South Carolina, slightly less far away. If only Senator Graham were here for me to take advantage of that comparison. John Brandolino is the director of the Division for Treaty Affairs at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, where he oversees UN-mandated policy processes related to drug and crime, and technical assistance centers related to corruption, organized crime, money laundering, cybercrime, and terrorism. Mr. Brandolino previously served in a variety of positions at the U.S. State Department's Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, including as acting Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director for the Office of Anti-Crime Programs. Before that, Mr. Brandolino worked for the American Bar Association, served as Assistant General Counsel for the Multinational Force and Observers, did some time here in the United States Senate, and also as an aide to the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Vanda Felbab-Brown is a Senior Fellow in the Center for Security Strategy and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. She's the Director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors and co-director of the Africa Security Initiative and the Brookings Series on Opioids, the Opioid Crisis in America, Domestic and International Dimensions. Dr. Felbab-Brown is an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. She's the author of the forthcoming Narco Noir, Mexico's Cartels, Cops, and Corruption, and is a frequent commentator in U.S. and international media. Finally, Clay Fuller is a research affiliate with the Walker Institute at the University of South Carolina. Previously, he was a Gene Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he has worked closely with the Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative, which is a great initiative that we've done a lot of work with over the years. And he is a current member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. His academic and policy work highlights how modern dictators, terrorists, and criminals utilize free market to consolidate and project power. Dr. Fuller recently authored a report on dismantling the authoritarian corruption nexus, which examines the national security implications of domestic and international economic policy. I am very grateful to all of their witnesses. You can tell from their bios they are perfectly suited for this hearing, and I look forward to hearing from them. And if we can, why don't we begin with Mr. Brandolino coming in from Vienna, I believe.
Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, distinguished members of the caucus, good evening from Vienna. It's an honor to join you today to outline how the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, or UNODC, is helping countries around the world to address drug trafficking and related corruption. My written statement provides more background about our organization, so I won't get into detail, but using our unique vantage point of being the secretariat to the most important policy processes, global policy process related to drugs and crime, and having a technical assistance and political presence in 124 countries, supplemented by our continuing data gathering and research, I'd like to share how we try to build our knowledge about illicit drug flows and related corruption and what we're doing to address it.
Please proceed. Have we lost signal?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the U.S. Department of State, INL Bureau, for their longstanding policy, substantive, and financial support for many key areas of our work, and the Department of Justice, which regularly contributes its expertise to our work around the world. First, there are two levels that we address this issue. First is a very general one. There's a science to fighting corruption. It's developed over decades. An effective anti-corruption regime consists of actions taken by many stakeholders on a number of different fronts. This means engagement and simultaneous actions by governments, private sector, and civil society. And the wide-ranging set of actions and commitments that consist of an anti-corruption holistic regime are actually found in the UN Convention Against Corruption in its chapters relating to prevention, criminalization, international cooperation, and asset recovery. And one path that we use to fight corruption generally is to ensure that effective action is being taken at all these fronts and that there is visible and holistic anti-corruption regime within a specific country involving all actors. But in addition to this, the second path is we need to also understand the different contexts of corruption and develop measures that are tailored to combating and preventing corruption in those specific contexts. And my written statement discusses how UNODC is trying to better understand drug flows and related illicit financial flows, which in turn allows us to target corruption points that facilitate those flows. When we know that drugs or related illicit financial flows take certain paths among source, transit, and other destinations, then we can start to dig deeper to identify where corruption may facilitate those flows. For example, where corruption moves by land, where drugs move by land, there may be government officials, including border authorities and law enforcement officials, along the way who may be exposed to greater corruption risks. Our CrimJust program, which has been involved in cross-cutting work related to the cocaine trafficking route from South America to Europe and is now being expanded to other parts of the world involving all types of drug flows, have been involved in targeting corruption points that help move drug flows. We are seeing, for example, that bribes are paid to obtain false documents, avoid baggage checks, obtain confidential information on law enforcement measures, and secure safe passage for drugs across borders. Organized crime groups frequently use corrupt practices also to recover drugs seized and placed under the custody of law enforcement authorities. Money laundering is obviously, as has been discussed today, used to move and hide corrupt proceeds, but corruption can also help fuel the laundering of proceeds generally of illicit drug activity. So we need to understand how corruption can facilitate, for example, bulk cash flows and trade-based money laundering when those types of laundering are used. We can predict with confidence that the proceeds of crime and corruption will seek to exploit the anonymity of cryptocurrencies and corporate vehicles, and we further need to understand how corruption might facilitate these relatively new avenues. It is a jigsaw puzzle for sure, but we are continually trying to add pieces to the puzzle. And so what is UNODC doing specifically? What are we doing to target these corruption points? I mentioned our CrimJust program, which addresses the cross-cutting issue of corruption through an integrity component aimed at drug law enforcement units and judicial authorities. We're now in 22 countries. Our UNODC container control program and our AirCop program are active in 99 seaports and 26 airports throughout the globe. Our experts use their knowledge on the ground to help identify unique corruption risk points at each single port and how to address them. Our global program on money laundering has developed a series of trainings related to investigating movement of funds via cryptocurrencies, particularly corrupt proceeds. And we have a number of prevention-related programs that support anti-corruption authorities, supreme audit institutions, procurement bodies, and other oversight bodies, and also to strengthen effective reporting mechanisms that ensure high levels of confidentiality. And we have established a series of regional platforms to fast-track implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, including a platform for South America and Mexico. Finally, in this context, we have created a special partnership with the World Bank, known as the Stolen Asset Recovery or STAR Initiative. We provide practitioners with knowledge and policy tools on cutting-edge issues related to preventing the laundering of proceeds of corruption. In conclusion, continued support is necessary for activities that target corruption risk points and apply the measures contemplated in the UN Convention Against Corruption. My written statement provides more information on our work and our programs, and I commend that to you. But as a leader in international anti-corruption efforts, since the very early days of anti-corruption, the contributions of the United States in regard to funding, expertise, and influencing international policy will be critical to moving forward this work and international anti-corruption work generally. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Brandolino. Next, Ms. Felby-Brown, please proceed. From Iraq.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chairman White House, Chairman Grassley, and distinguished members of this committee. I am honored to have the opportunity to address the caucus. As was mentioned, I'm speaking from Iraq, and my electricity is going in and out. I hope that won't affect my testimony and engagement with the members of the drug caucus. The lack of electricity or sporadic nature of it here in Iraq is itself one of the manifestations of corruption. Vast illegal economies, such as the drug trade, strongly exacerbate corruption and undermine the rule of law. Conversely, corruption undermines counter-narcotics efforts, be they interdiction of drug trafficking networks in places such as Mexico, Afghanistan, or Honduras, efforts to build legal livelihoods for those marginalized populations that participate in the production of illegal drugs, as is often the case in Colombia, where government officials, vested elites, and exclusionary vested interests appropriate money meant for development of legal livelihoods. And in some cases, such as in Venezuela, North Korea, or Myanmar, entire regime survival is deeply intertwined and dependent on the persistence of exclusionary patronage, corruption, and illegal economies, such as the drug trade. Similarly, in Central America's Northern Triangle, such systems of political exclusion and patronage have for decades dominated the countries and become deeply intertwined with the drug trade, with criminal organizations penetrating the highest levels of the government, such as in Honduras. So from this overview, it is obvious that corruption is complex and not uniform. Consequently, one anti-corruption strategy does not fit all settings. Very frequently, however, anti-corruption policies are not simply monumental tasks, they are profoundly political tasks to reshape local and even national political arrangements and orders in the countries. They are not merely technical undertakings. If they are considered and developed as merely technical projects, They can generate perhaps some capacity abroad, but they will fail to generate adequate political will, and in fact might be undermined. Indeed, we have seen in various parts of the world that when anti-corruption efforts become effective and become neutral, not merely targeting political enemies of current government officials, they become undermined by those very same current government officials. The attacks and efforts to dismantle CICIG in Guatemala and Machi in Honduras are prime examples. At other times, both counter-narcotics and anti-corruption efforts are co-opted to, in fact, perpetuate the very system of narrow, parochial, rapacious, predatory, corrupt rule and merely target political and business enemies. The record of police reform, so fundamental for anti-corruption and counter-narcotics efforts, has been highly disappointing around the world. Often the preferred solutions in places where corruption is pervasive across agencies and layers of government is building special interdiction units. And indeed, they can be very effective tools, yet once again, often when they become effective, the governments tend to dismantle them, or we have also seen circumstances where they go rogue and become, in fact, top criminals in the country. And finally, I want to say that violence matters. The more violent a criminal setting is, such as in Mexico, the harder it becomes for government officials to resist corruption, particularly if local level officials have little to no backup protection from national level governments. In my written statement, I provide a detailed set of policy recommendations. Let me just make let me just pull out very few examples from that. One is that corruption efforts need to be prioritized to focus on settings where entire communities are excluded from access to jobs or markets, because this will generate political will both to proceed in anti-corruption efforts and to mount effective counter-narcotics efforts. But because they are profoundly political undertakings, they required a systematic policy from the get-go to build political alliances of support for the persistence and advancement of anti-corruption efforts. The US long-term goal needs to be strengthening checks and balances within the political system, reducing patronage, clientelism, all of which enable corruption. I want to also highlight something that came out in the previous panel, namely that the presence of US law enforcement officials, such as DA official, is frequently key to monitoring the systems of corruption and penetration by criminal groups into political and law enforcement system, and often stimulates at least some action. And finally, integrating into anti-narcotics and anti-corruption policies, strategies to reduce criminal violence is critical. If violence persists at very high levels, governments lose will to continue with both anti-corruption and anti-drug policies, and very high violence levels enable criminal groups to be effective in their corruption strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Feldby-Brown. And finally, Mr. Fuller, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse and Grassley, for inviting me to share my thoughts on this important topic with the Drug Caucus today. Although I am a native Texan, hello from South Carolina. So the nexus between the illicit drug trade and corruption is a topic that's of great interest to me. As you mentioned, I authored a report at the American Enterprise Institute in 2019 on dismantling the authoritarian corruption nexus, which this directly addresses the global competition between systems of governance that Senator Whitehouse referred to in his opening remarks. That report points out that greater economic transparency done in a way that protects individual privacy rights is a nonviolent asymmetrical weapon that can be used against our adversaries. And these adversaries include not only nation states, but drug traffickers and corrupt foreign officials also. So I completely applaud US efforts to stem drug flows and corruption around the world. However, the world, and especially the very, very dark world of illicit drugs and corruption, has changed dramatically in just the past 5 years. and has sped up, especially since the pandemic began, and has become much, much worse. And so to answer Senator Grassley's question in his opening remarks about whether or not what we're doing is working, in my opinion, it seems clear from the data that I look at as a political scientist that what we have been doing is not working, or at least not working very well. When looking at the data, nearly all corruption measures around the world are up. Nearly all democracy measures around the world are down. Drug use and overdoses are constantly rising, and to hear that 100,000 Americans died of overdose deaths just since the pandemic began is a very depressing statistic. So what I've done today for my written testimony and these comments is I've brought 3 ideas here that I've spoken about before that I think may be of help to Congress and the free world's fight against authoritarianism and non-democracy and corruption in the important work here of this caucus and Congress. The first idea, similar to how FinCEN, or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the US Treasury, they began issuing geographic targeting orders to address money laundering through real estate here in the US. We could, I think, develop global geographic targeting orders to address the key transshipment points where drugs are moved through, that often involve large-scale corruption in customs. These are usually foreign trade zones, also known as free trade zones or special economic zones or free ports. We could spend a lot of time updating those and getting more information on them. And I've worked with the Helsinki Commission on drafting ideas for how we would go about identifying the worst offenders, and I identify a lot of them in my written testimony. The second idea I have here is that we should start, in my opinion, incorporating existing international treaties on drugs and corruption into all regional and bilateral trade agreements. So these were referred to UNCAC and others. As far as I know, Chapter 27 of the USMCA, which was the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA recently, this was the first time that this was ever done in our trade agreements, was to incorporate anti-corruption and drug treaties into trade agreements. And I think that should be something that we should think about doing all the time. Third idea is that we need to radically rethink how we think about transparency. I see it as credible information instead of digging for dirt on things we don't like and exposing them. I see it as credible information that everybody can see and make their own decisions about. We can do this, we can create this new kind of transparency by utilizing new and powerful technologies such as blockchain technology and cryptocurrency. These technologies are developing and being adopted at a speed that is difficult to comprehend, and it's even harder for governments to keep up with. But the thing that's most misunderstood about them is that they are built on the premise of enforcing an unbreakable transparency. And they do this through decentralizing everything, decentralizing finance and decentralizing the internet, so we don't have things like the HSBC incidents that were referred to earlier. Many, if not most, of the companies developing and operating these technologies have been begging Congress for a while now for a clear framework on how they will be able to be regulated. And I think this is a clear opportunity for Congress and for the Drug Caucus to help create this framework in a way that will prioritize the transparency of the technology without hurting the innovation in this area. And with that, I thank you and welcome your questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Fuller, and thanks to the whole panel. You're a very expert group, and I appreciate that you've joined us from all around the globe. Mr. Brandolino, no doubt in your mind that there's a nexus between international corruption and our own country's national security, correct?
Absolutely. Every country's security.
And that said, if you could have your way, what would you like to see as best case outcomes from the Summit for Democracy?
I think the Summit of Democracy, like the addressing corruption, is a long-term project. And I hope this summit can come up with some concrete ideas that we can move forward internationally with other partners. So I think it's important to bring other international cooperation and multilateral work is important because we need to have a number of countries going down the same path. There's strength in numbers. So I think we need to identify the measures we want people to take, the path we want to go down, and bring a number of countries with us.
Thank you. And Ms. Feldbab-Brown, in terms of disrupting narcotics finance, what would you think the best outcomes could be with respect to disrupting safe havens for the proceeds of the international drug trade?
Well, building both legal frameworks that require governments to take some action, and then building political coalitions within countries, investing in building political coalitions in those countries to, in fact, enforce those legal structures.
And Mr. Fuller, again, thank you for your work in this space. It's really been terrific to work with Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative over the years. What would you like to see, similar question to Mr. Brandolino's, what would you like to see come out of the Summit for Democracy? And if I could ask you to tag on to Ms. Feldbab-Brown, specifically, what would you like to see come out for the Summit for Democracy that would relate to disrupting safe havens for international criminal drug financing?
Thank you for the question. I would like to see a focus on improving trade and supply chains, specifically as related to foreign trade zones, these transshipment points. I've been studying these for more than a decade now, and they're very understudied, not understood, underregulated. There's very little data on them, and they have a very critical, in my view, point in all of this that has been overlooked for a very long time.
Last question. What would you particularly like to see us do in dealing with the Mexican cartels and the border trade with the United States? Anybody?
Is that for me?
Question?
Is that for me?
Sure.
Well, again, the trade zones, or I mentioned USMCA. We could start enforcing Chapter 27 out of it, and actually bringing cases out of that is something that could be done. But I'd have to look into some other ideas specifically for that. Encouraging Mexico to pay their police more, especially at the border, would help with the corruption issue, I believe.
I guess one final question. Does anybody disagree with the response from the official panel that we have adequate resources in terms of sanctions of people involved in corruption and that they're being deployed adequately?
Perhaps I can start, Mr. Chairman. I think that the Magnitsky Act is a very powerful tool that can be applied across a great range of issues that has been applied for, that very much links to both corruption and counter-narcotics. For example, the issue of dark net, deep net, cryptocurrency, and money laundering has been mentioned. Many of the organizations are also linked to powerful states, including China and Russia. And in my view, there are opportunities to use the Magnitsky Act to sanction some of the proxies that engage in using cryptocurrency for laundering all kinds of proceeds, as well as other attacks against the United States. And if I may to add one comment to Mexico, I just spent several weeks in Mexico exploring corruption, drug trade, and other illegal economies in the country. And I'm deeply concerned about the situation there. I've traveled there, done research there over the past 20 years, and I have perhaps never found such extensive territories, populations, and government officials intimidated by drug trafficking groups, feeling they don't have adequate backup from the federal government, from Mexico City, and increasingly not simply criminal groups co-opting government officials at all levels of the governments and across law enforcement agencies, something that requires far greater set of measures than simply raising salaries, but in fact criminal groups fielding political candidates to run for office.
Thank you very much. Let me turn it over to my co-chair, Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask my first question of Felbab Brown, but I'm going to introduce it with what she already knows about fentanyl and the adulterating that product with other drugs. And then it gets into the United States. We've spent $3 billion through the Merida initiative to promote counter-narcotics efforts in Mexico. One of the goals of the initiative is to strengthen Mexico's criminal justice system. Rooting out corruption is an essential piece of that. So how do weak criminal justice systems in neighboring countries impact the United States counter-narcotics goals and policies?
Well, the functioning of the criminal justice system abroad is absolutely fundamental to minimizing illegal drug trade, corruption, and protecting U.S. national security and the lives of U.S. citizens. And indeed, the effort that the United States put in helping Mexico improve the justice system through the Merida Initiative made some very important progress. The most significant one being improvements to the judicial system, such as switching to oral trials and moving from a pure inquisitorial system to a system that's a hybrid of inquisitorial and accusatorial system. This is important progress. It's highly imperfect. It's also under threat with significant rollbacks to that system. And it's something that I hope will continue to be a significant part of the bicentennial framework efforts. We are yet to see the details of what the framework actually will mean in practice. I am concerned that if the framework ends up defined on the part of the Mexican government as the United States stops the flows of money, weapons, and demands in the US, and Mexico does what it wants inside its borders, that it will not be an effective framework.
Also to you as well, I want you to tell us how to spend our taxpayer dollars more wisely. How can we better assist partner nations with defending against corruption and preventing the flow of illicit drugs destined for the United States?
Well, there is a wide set of measures, Mr. Chairman. I outlined some of it in the written testimony. Let me perhaps pull up one. A very key element of those strategies is building special interdiction units. Yet oftentimes we are forced to work with units in which only some members are vetted, in which perhaps top-level officials refuse to be vetted. If something like that happens, we should immediately see that that should already raise red flags about the genuine commitment on the part of our bilateral counterparts to the use of special investigative units. We also see that when they are effective, they often come under threat and perhaps are dismantled. So building them might require building or trying to encourage the development of legal political framework that would not subject those units to merely political discretion of being dismantled.
Dr. Fuller, what lessons should we be taking away from our money laundering and counter-narcotic strategies, and what can the United States do better than we're now doing?
Many things. As attitudes towards marijuana change around the world, and especially here in the United States, it might be prudent to start thinking about shifting resources towards focusing on cocaine, fentanyl, and heroin and other drugs. Around the world, working with our partner nations, there are very cheap and inexpensive things that we can do that would have great effect, such as teaching our partner nations how to generate, collect, and disseminate more credible aggregate data about what's going on in their country. So for example, the statistic mentioned earlier that 100,000 Americans died of overdoses during the pandemic. It's credible, and I believe it. And it affects me, and it encourages me as an individual to want to do something to help fix that statistic. A lot of our partner countries around the world don't collect much or any data that's either believable or exists. I went through and tried to calculate what each country around the world spends on collecting statistics for each individual on things in their country, and the United States by far spends more per person collecting data than any other country in the world. The UK was second, but then you start getting into Africa and East Asia and Latin America, and it dramatically drops down to very, very little. So we could send data scientists and computers to these countries and teach them, better data collection and dissemination methods.
My time's up, Mr. Chairman.
If you have another question, please feel free to proceed. If not, we will conclude the hearing. Let me thank the panel and particularly thank our tech support team for bringing them in from Vienna, Iraq, and South Carolina. This has been, I think, a very helpful hearing, and I'm very grateful for the expertise and participation of each one of you. Thanks so much for being with us, and we look forward to continuing to work with you as we prepare for the Summit for Democracy and to assert a really strong American role in international transparency in our clash with kleptocracy, autocracy, and criminality. With that, the hearing is concluded. Thank you all.